It was larger than the White House, hosted presidents and royalty, and was known as the Versailles of America. But today, if you visit the site, you won't find a single wall standing. How did a 147-room palace completely disappear from the face of the earth? The address still exists: 1500 Bethlehem Pike, Spring House, Pennsylvania. Drive there today and you'll find a development called Whitemarsh Valley. Modest houses on curved streets, families arriving home from work, children playing in yards that reveal nothing of what lies beneath. The ground remembers, even if no one living does. Walk these streets and try to imagine. Picture a mansion so vast it required its own power plant. Envision walls that once held Rembrandts and Gainsboroughs, ballrooms where presidents danced, gardens designed by the same minds that shaped Versailles. Picture 147 rooms filled with treasures collected across continents, servants moving through hidden corridors, chandeliers blazing through windows visible for miles. Picture all of this, and then picture it gone. Not damaged, not repurposed, simply erased as though it never existed. No historical marker stands here. No plaque explains what was lost. The families living in these homes often have no idea that their morning coffee is consumed above spaces where industrial titans once plotted the fate of nations, where society women competed in gowns that cost more than houses, where a fortune bled itself dry trying to purchase something money could never buy. This is the story of Whitemarsh Hall, and it begins where all tragedies must begin. At the end, standing in the ruins that aren't even ruins anymore, just emptiness pretending to be ordinary. It begins with a question that seems impossible to answer. How does the largest private residence in American history disappear so completely that most people have never heard its name? The answer lies not in disaster or war, not in fire or flood, but in something far more unsettling. Whitemarsh Hall vanished because no one wanted it. This palace, built to announce arrival and command respect, built to last centuries and establish a dynasty, survived barely 30 years before being sold for scrap and bulldozed into oblivion. The cost to build it exceeded $3 million in 1920s money. The price paid to destroy it, $54,000. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how something so magnificent could become so worthless, we must travel back to a time when fortunes were counted differently, when a single man could command wealth that rivaled nations, when the word impossible had not yet been spoken to American ambition. We must meet the banker who helped finance the First World War, and the woman who married him with a vision that would reshape the Pennsylvania landscape forever. The palace is gone, but its story survives. And that story begins not with construction, but with hunger. Not for food, but for something far more elusive, acceptance in a world that no amount of money seemed able to unlock. Edward Townsend Stotesbury arrived at Drexel and Company in 1866 carrying nothing but ambition and a recommendation letter. He was 17 years old, born to middle-class Quaker parents who had given him an education but no fortune. The salary was $16.60 per month. It was barely enough to live on, but Stotesbury understood something that his contemporaries did not. In the world of high finance, entry mattered more than immediate compensation. He came from Philadelphia's Friends Central School with a business education from Pierce College, institutions that taught practicality over prestige. His father ran a sugar refinery. His mother was a devout Quaker who named him after a prominent member of the Friends meeting. Nothing in this background suggested the trajectory that would follow. But then, the great fortunes of the Gilded Age were rarely inherited. They were seized by men who understood that patience and discipline could compound into power. Stotesbury made himself indispensable. He arrived before anyone else and left after they had gone. He kept meticulous records of every penny, every transaction, every conversation that mattered. When others socialized, he studied the patterns of capital flow. He watched how Anthony Joseph Drexel, the firm's founder, maneuvered through the intricate dance of corporate finance. He learned that in banking, discretion was more valuable than brilliance, reliability more precious than creativity. When Drexel formed his partnership with J. Pierpont Morgan in 1871, creating an alliance that would reshape American finance, Stotesbury was there, absorbing every lesson. The firm became Drexel, Morgan and Company, a name that would make presidents nervous and railroad barons obedient. And this young clerk, this son of modest Philadelphia Quakers, positioned himself at the center of something unprecedented. 16 years after he arrived carrying that letter of recommendation, Stotesbury was made a partner. He was 33 years old. The year was 1882, and he had just gained entry to a world where fortunes were measured not in millions, but in the power to move markets, to finance nations, to decide which enterprises would flourish and which would collapse into bankruptcy. His rise coincided with personal devastation. His first wife, Frances Berman Butcher, gave him 3 daughters, though one died in infancy. In 1881, Frances died, giving birth to their 3rd child. She was 31. Stotesbury was left a widower at 32, with 2 young daughters and a partnership in one of the world's most powerful financial institutions. He would remain unmarried for the next 30 years, devoting himself entirely to the business of building empires. And build them he did. When Anthony Drexel died in 1893, Stotesbury became senior partner of Drexel and Company. He was simultaneously a partner in J.P. Morgan and Company in New York, serving as Morgan's primary representative in Philadelphia. This dual position gave him a power that few men in America could claim. He became the architect of railroad reorganizations that changed how America moved. He helped finance the creation of United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in history. He assisted in floating the Chinese loan of 1909, helping to finance a nation on the other side of the world. J. Pierpont Morgan himself called Stotesbury the man who knew more about the banking business than anyone in America. It was not empty praise. While Morgan was the public face, the titan whose name represented financial power itself, Stotesbury was the mechanism, the man who understood every detail, every risk, every possibility. When railroads needed reorganization, when governments needed loans, when corporations needed capital, Stotesbury knew how to structure the deal. His philosophy was simple, distilled into advice he would repeat throughout his life. Keep your mouth shut and your ears open. While others talked, he listened. While others speculated, he calculated. While others chased immediate gains, he built long-term relationships with the only currency that truly mattered in high finance: trust. By the 1920s, his fortune was estimated at $100 million. In today's terms, approaching $2 billion. He had become one of the wealthiest men in America, a financial power whose decisions rippled through the entire economy. He sat on the boards of the Reading Railroad, the Lehigh Valley Railroad, multiple banks, steel companies, insurance firms. His reach extended into nearly every major industry. But money, he was beginning to understand, did not purchase everything. Philadelphia's old families, the ones whose names appeared in the social register without question, the ones whose acceptance required no announcement, looked at Edward Stotesbury and saw an employee. They saw the son of a sugar refiner who had made money in trade, that most unforgivable of occupations. They saw Quaker modesty and banking competence, but they did not see one of their own. Stotesbury had spent 3 decades becoming indispensable to the most powerful men in America. He had helped finance wars, build industries, reshape the economic landscape itself. And yet, when Philadelphia society gathered in their drawing rooms, his name was rarely mentioned. He was wealthy, certainly. He was powerful, undoubtedly. But he was not, and perhaps never would be, one of them. Then, in 1912, at the age of 62, Edward Stotesbury married Eva Roberts Cromwell. She was a widow with 3 children and ambitions that would make his fortune seem like preparation rather than achievement. She was 41 years old, beautiful, socially astute, and hungry for recognition in a way that Stotesbury himself had never been. His life had been about accumulation, about building power through discipline and discretion. Hers would be about display, about forcing the world to acknowledge what it had chosen to ignore. Together, they would attempt something that no amount of money had yet managed to accomplish. They would build acceptance itself, room by room, stone by stone, until Philadelphia had no choice but to let them in. She was born Lucretia Bishop Roberts in Chicago in 1865, though no one ever called her anything but Eva. Her father was James Roberts, her upbringing middle class but respectable. She married Oliver Eaton Cromwell in 1889 and had 3 children, Oliver Jr., James, and Louise. When Oliver died in 1909, Eva found herself a widow at 44 with social ambitions but limited means to pursue them. Then came the cruise in 1912. Somewhere between ports, she met Edward Townsend Stotesbury, 20 years her senior, recently widowed for 3 decades, possessed of $100 million and no particular idea what to do with it socially. They married on January 18th of that year. He was 63. She was 41. And Philadelphia society, watching this union, understood immediately what Eva understood. Money alone would never be enough. Philadelphia was not New York. In New York, you could buy your way into society if you had enough capital and threw sufficiently spectacular parties. Mrs. Astor's 400 might resist, but resistance could be worn down through sheer persistence and display. Boston had its Brahmins, equally impenetrable but at least consistent in their standards. Philadelphia was different. Philadelphia had families whose names appeared in colonial records, whose ancestors had founded the city itself, whose wealth was so old it had ceased to require discussion. These were proper Philadelphians, old Philadelphians, families like the Cadwalladers and Biddles who could trace their lineage to the very beginning of Pennsylvania. They were Quakers and Episcopalians who valued restraint over ostentation, breeding over fortune, discretion over display. A man could be the richest financier at J.P. Morgan and still be considered merely employed. A woman could marry that man and still find herself excluded from drawing rooms that mattered. Eva had married into wealth, certainly, but she had not married into acceptance, and every door that closed told her so. She looked at Philadelphia's social landscape with a clarity that Edward, for all his financial genius, had never possessed. He had spent his life building empires of capital. She would spend hers building something more difficult, a social empire that could not be ignored. The weapon she chose was architecture itself. The Vanderbilts had the Breakers in Newport, a summer cottage that redefined what cottage meant. The Rockefellers had Kyquit in the Hudson Valley. The Wideners, Philadelphia's own streetcar magnates, had Linwood Hall with its 110 rooms. If acceptance could not be purchased through good breeding, it would have to be commanded through sheer magnificence. Eva would build something so undeniably grand that Philadelphia society would have no choice but to acknowledge it, and by extension, acknowledge her. She knew exactly who could deliver this vision. Horace Trumbauer was Philadelphia's architect of impossible dreams, the man who had already designed Linwood Hall for Peter Widener. Born in Frankfurt in 1868, Trumbauer had dropped out of school at 14 to work as an office boy at an architectural firm. No formal education, no university degree, just raw talent and an understanding of what wealth wanted to see reflected back at itself. By 1890, he had opened his own office. His first commission earned him $171.75. But talent compounds like interest, and Trumbauer's talent was prodigious. Greytowers Castle in 1893 for sugar magnate William Welsh. Harrison launched him into prominence. Then came Linwood Hall, and suddenly Trumbauer was the architect every industrial baron wanted. He understood Georgian revival, French Renaissance, Beaux-Arts classicism. He could design in any style wealth demanded, and he could do it at a scale that made other architects nervous. More importantly, Trumbauer understood discretion. He hired Julian Abel, the first African-American graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's architecture program, and made him chief designer in 1908. Abel designed much of what bore Trumbauer's name, but in an era when such arrangements were impossible to acknowledge publicly, both men understood the necessity of silence. Trumbauer hired his brains, as he said, and his brains were exceptional. The Stotesburys had already worked with him. When they married, their first project was redecorating Edward's Philadelphia townhouse at 1923 Walnut Street. Trumbauer renovated it twice, each time more lavishly. But a townhouse, no matter how magnificent, remained a townhouse. It was urban, constrained by the lots on either side, limited by the street in front. What Eva envisioned required space. 300 acres of space. She found it in Springfield Township, Montgomery County. Rolling Pennsylvania hills, close enough to Philadelphia to maintain connections, but far enough to create a world unto itself. The land alone spoke of ambition. But land was merely the canvas. The painting would require something unprecedented. Eva told Trumbauer what she wanted. A palace that would rival anything in Europe. A residence so magnificent that no Philadelphia family, no matter how old their lineage, could dismiss it as vulgar new money. It would have ballrooms that could hold hundreds, gardens designed by the finest landscape architects, rooms filled with art that old masters would recognize. It would employ a staff larger than most companies. It would consume budgets that made other mansions seem economical. Most importantly, it would force recognition. When Philadelphia society drove past on their way to their own country estates, they would see Whitemarsh Hall rising on its hill like a Georgian monument to American possibility. They might not invite the Stotesburys to their private dinners, but they could not pretend the Stotesburys did not exist. Trumbauer listened to all of this and understood immediately what was being asked. This was not merely a commission. This was a campaign, and architecture was the weapon. He had built mansions before, dozens of them, for the Wideners and Elkins and all the families who already possessed what Eva was trying to acquire. Now he would build one for someone trying to break through from the outside. In 1916, construction began. The plans showed 147 rooms across 6 floors, 3 above ground and 3 below. The structure would be Georgian revival, that architectural language of English country houses and colonial American dignity. 50-foot limestone columns would announce the entrance. A ballroom stretching 64 feet would accommodate hundreds of guests. The estate would require its own power plant, its own infrastructure, its own complete world. Eva oversaw every detail. She traveled to Paris to select decorators. She purchased art from dealers who supplied European nobility. She commissioned landscape architect Jacques Greber, the man who would later design Philadelphia's Benjamin Franklin Parkway, to create gardens that combined French formality with English naturalism. Every choice was calculated. Every expense was justified by the ultimate goal, forcing Philadelphia to acknowledge that Eva Stotesbury belonged. Edward, for his part, wrote the checks. He was 70 years old when construction started, and he would be 75 when it finished. He had spent a lifetime accumulating capital through discipline and discretion. Now he was spending it through display and excess, all because the woman he married understood something he had never quite grasped. That in Philadelphia society, being the richest man at Morgan's was not enough. You had to look the part. You had to live the part. You had to build the part in limestone and marble until no one could look away. They called it Whitemarsh Hall, and it would be their masterpiece. or their monument. Or perhaps their warning to anyone who thought acceptance could be engineered through architecture alone. Time would reveal which. Construction began in October of 1916. Eva moved into a house on the property immediately, positioning herself where she could watch every stone being laid, every column raised, every window installed. This was not a project she would delegate. This was her vision being transformed from architectural drawings into limestone and marble reality, and she intended to witness every moment of its birth. The site itself presented both opportunity and challenge. 300 acres of rolling Pennsylvania hills, elevated enough to command views of the surrounding countryside, close enough to Philadelphia to maintain connections, but distant enough to create a self-contained world. The land alone announced ambition, but transforming raw hillside into a palace required an army. Workers descended on Springfield Township in numbers that changed the character of the entire area. Teams of masons, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, laborers worked simultaneously on different aspects of the massive structure. The main house would be U-shaped, 6 stories total with 3 above ground and 3 below. Georgian Revival in style, it would speak the architectural language of English country houses and colonial American dignity, a language that Philadelphia's old families understood even if they refused to acknowledge the Stotesburys' claim to speak it. 50-foot limestone columns began rising at the main entrance, each one a statement of permanence and classical proportion. The ballroom alone measured 64 feet in length, capable of holding hundreds of guests. 147 rooms spread across 100,000 square feet of space, including 45 bathrooms, each one appointed with fixtures that would make ordinary luxury seem economical. A gymnasium, a movie theater, a refrigerating plant. 3 elevators to move between floors. This was not merely a house, it was infrastructure on the scale of a small institution. The estate required its own power plant. You could not rely on municipal utilities when your mansion consumed electricity like a factory. Water systems, heating systems, cooling systems, all needed to be engineered specifically for a structure of this magnitude. 4 large greenhouses would grow trees and ferns. Smaller greenhouses would cultivate the constant supply of flowers that Eva's parties would require. The gardens themselves, designed by Jacques Grébert in both formal French and naturalistic English styles, would need 70 gardeners to maintain. Then came the war. In April of 1917, the United States entered World War I, and suddenly the materials Eva needed became nearly impossible to obtain. European marble, French tapestries, Italian statuary, English antiques, all the elements she had been sourcing from across the Atlantic were now trapped behind submarine blockades and military priorities. The exterior structure could proceed with American limestone and local labor, but the interiors, the decorative elements that would transform stone and wood into magnificence, those would have to wait. By the end of 1918, when the armistice finally came, the mansion stood largely complete on the outside. Its walls rose imposingly on the hill. Its columns announced themselves to anyone passing on Old York Road. But inside, rooms waited empty for the treasures that would fill them. Eva had been collecting for years, traveling to Paris to work with decorators, purchasing from dealers who supplied European nobility. Now, with peace restored, those shipments could finally resume. Sir Charles Allam handled the interior decoration, the same man who had worked on British royal residences. He understood how to create rooms that whispered old money while shouting new wealth. The walls were embellished with gilded plasterwork, white and sea-green marble, antiques sourced predominantly from England and France through Joseph Duveen, the art dealer who supplied America's industrial barons with European legitimacy, one painting at a time. Bathrooms received bronze dolphin faucets. 5 by 10-foot gilt mirrors watched over staircases. Marble statues and urns from Italy appeared both within the mansion and throughout the gardens. A pipe organ rose 3 stories, capable of being heard throughout the entire house. Eva adored organ music and insisted it be played continuously during afternoons and evenings when they had guests. The sound would become part of Whitemarsh's identity, Bach and Handel echoing through marble halls while Philadelphia society tried to decide whether to be impressed or appalled. The Stotesburys partially occupied the mansion in 1920, while finishing work continued around them. Imagine living in construction, in rooms that were complete, while others remained scaffolded, furniture arriving while workers still installed final fixtures. But Eva wanted to be there, wanted to begin the process of making this structure not just a house, but the house, the residence that would define their position in Philadelphia society, whether Philadelphia liked it or not. Construction finally wrapped completely in 1921. 5 years from groundbreaking to completion. The total cost remains disputed even by historians, with estimates ranging from $3 million to $10 million, depending on whether you count just the structure or include all the furnishings, art, and infrastructure. Even at the conservative estimate of $3 million, it was an astronomical sum, more than most people would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. $10 million was simply incomprehensible, roughly equivalent to $160 million in modern currency. Think about what that meant. Edward Stotesbury had spent a fortune that could have funded hospitals, universities, entire towns on a single residence for himself and his wife. The staff required to run it numbered 70 people. Butlers, maids, cooks, valets, chauffeurs, 70 gardeners alone to maintain the grounds. These were not occasional employees. These were full-time positions, each one requiring salary, housing, management, the infrastructure to support the infrastructure. And yet, even before the mansion was complete, even as workers were still installing those final gilt mirrors and bronze faucets, Eva was already planning the inauguration. In 1921, she would host a christening ball that would force Philadelphia to acknowledge what they had built. 800 guests would attend, including the future King Gustav VI of Sweden and Marshal Joseph Joffre, the French hero of World War I. 4 orchestras would play simultaneously. Personalized guest amenities like chauffeured transport would be provided. Every detail would announce that Whitemarsh Hall had arrived, and therefore the Stotesburys had arrived, regardless of what Philadelphia's old families thought. The mansion was complete, the gardens were immaculate, the staff was trained, the art was hung, the organ was playing. On that hill in Springfield Township stood what would become known as the American Versailles, a palace that exceeded in scale and luxury almost anything built privately in the United States. It was everything Eva had envisioned, everything Edward's fortune could purchase, everything Trumbauer's talent could design. The only question remaining was whether any of it would accomplish what Eva had spent 5 years and millions of dollars trying to achieve: acceptance into a world that had already decided she did not belong. The golden age of Whitemarsh Hall lasted barely 9 years, but what years they were. From 1921 until the crash of 1929, the mansion pulsed with a life so extravagant it seemed almost mythical even to those who witnessed it. Eva had built her stage. Now she would perform. The parties began almost immediately after completion. Not small gatherings, not intimate dinners, but balls that required 4 orchestras playing simultaneously in different rooms. Events where 800 guests arrived in procession. Celebrations that lasted until dawn broke over the Pennsylvania hills. The inaugural ball in 1921 set the standard. Crown Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden attended, along with Marshal Joseph Joffre, the French military hero who had saved Paris during the Great War. Philadelphia society could pretend the Stotesburys didn't belong, but royalty and war heroes had no such hesitations. Eva orchestrated every detail with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Flowers from the estate's greenhouses transformed ballrooms into gardens. The pipe organ, rising 3 stories through the heart of the mansion, played continuously during afternoons and evenings, filling marble halls with Bach and Handel. She adored organ music, this constant soundtrack of classical majesty that announced to everyone within hearing distance that culture lived here, that refinement had found a home in these walls. The ballroom itself stretched 64 feet, its gilded plasterwork catching candlelight and chandelier glow, white and sea-green marble creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously regal and ethereal. Guests moved through spaces that had been designed not just for function, but for spectacle. Every room offered something to admire. 5 by 10-foot gilt mirrors reflected candlelight infinitely. Bronze dolphin faucets in 45 bathrooms announced that even utilitarian spaces deserved artistry. Oriental rugs from Persia covered floors that were themselves works of craftsmanship. The staff made it all possible. 40 servants worked inside the mansion itself, though this number swelled during major events. Butlers in formal livery, maids in starched uniforms, valets attending to every need before it could be articulated. 70 gardeners maintained the grounds, ensuring that the French formal gardens Jacques Greber had designed remained pristine, that the English naturalistic sections bloomed in calculated spontaneity, that the mile-long tree-lined approach to the mansion impressed visitors from the moment they turned onto the property. Henry Ford visited and declared afterward that it was a great experience to see how the rich live, a comment that captured both admiration and a certain unease. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister who had led his nation through the First World War, walked through Greber's gardens and proclaimed Whitemarsh Hall to be America's answer to Versailles. The nickname stuck, the American Versailles. Eva had wanted to force recognition. She had succeeded in creating a palace that even Europeans acknowledged. But the magnificence came at a cost that would eventually prove unsustainable. Edward himself once stated that maintaining Whitemarsh Hall required over $1 million annually. $1 million every single year just to keep the house functioning, the gardens maintained, the staff paid, the infrastructure operating. In modern terms, roughly $16 million annually, simply to exist in this palace they had built. The Stotesburys didn't live at Whitemarsh year-round. They couldn't. The Pennsylvania climate made that impractical, and their other estates demanded attention. They spent winters at El Mirasol, their sprawling Spanish Revival mansion in Palm Beach that Addison Meisner had designed. Summers found them at Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, Maine, another palatial retreat. Whitemarsh was for spring and fall, for the social seasons when Philadelphia society gathered, and Eva could deploy her most powerful weapon, the undeniable grandeur of her home. Her son Jimmy Cromwell lived at Whitemarsh frequently, occupying rooms designed specifically for him and his sister Louise. Eva's children from her first marriage had been incorporated into this world of extreme wealth, benefiting from Edward's fortune while maintaining their own identities. Jimmy would later marry Doris Duke, the tobacco heiress, in a union that combined two of America's greatest fortunes. Louise would have her own society triumphs. The Stotesbury-Cromwell family had arrived, whatever Philadelphia's old families might think. Eva displayed her jewelry collection at these gatherings with an openness that bordered on defiance. Diamonds, emeralds, pearls that had cost fortunes, worn not with subtle elegance but with deliberate prominence. This was wealth that refused to apologize for itself. During Prohibition, when serving alcohol became illegal, the Stotesburys maintained a wine cellar, secured by multiple locked doors and an alarm system, ensuring that their parties continued uninterrupted by legal inconveniences that applied to ordinary Americans. The mansion became famous not just for its architecture, but for what happened within it. Stories circulated through Philadelphia and beyond. The Stotesburys had reproduced European luxury on American soil. They had created a world where servants moved through hidden corridors so they wouldn't disturb the aesthetic perfection of the main spaces. They had installed a movie theater when cinema was still relatively novel. They had built a gymnasium when physical fitness was not yet fashionable. They had anticipated every possible desire and fulfilled it before it could fully form. For Eva, each party was a victory, each royal or important guest a vindication. She had married Edward wanting acceptance into Philadelphia society. What she achieved instead was something perhaps more significant: the creation of her own sphere of influence that existed parallel to and arguably superior to the old family's world. They had their genealogies and their Quaker restraint. She had Versailles in Pennsylvania, and anyone who wanted to experience American grandeur at its zenith had to acknowledge what she had built. But even as the chandeliers blazed and the orchestras played and the champagne flowed despite prohibition, shadows were gathering. The prosperity that had made Whitemarsh possible was built on speculation and leverage, on a stock market that climbed higher every month, on a belief that wealth would continue expanding forever. Edward was approaching 80 years old. Eva, though younger, was beginning to understand that performance requires constant energy, and energy eventually depletes. The Golden Age was magnificent while it lasted. The photographs that survive show rooms of impossible beauty, gardens that rivaled anything Europe could offer, spaces designed for a life that seemed immune to ordinary concerns like economy or restraint. But Golden Ages, by their nature, cannot last. They shine brilliantly precisely because they are temporary, because the conditions that create them are fragile, because magnificence always carries within it the seeds of its own dissolution. In October of 1929, the stock market would collapse, and with it, the world that had made Whitemarsh Hall possible. But for now, for these brief, shining years, Eva Stotesbury had achieved her impossible dream. She had built acceptance itself in limestone and marble, and for a moment, watching her guests dance in her ballroom under chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, she could believe it would last forever. On October 28, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted nearly 13%. The following day, Black Tuesday, another 12% evaporated. Between September 1st and November 30th, the stock market lost over half its value, dropping from $64 billion to approximately $30 billion. Fortunes that had seemed permanent revealed themselves as nothing more than numbers on paper, and those numbers were falling like autumn leaves. Edward Stotesbury was 80 years old when the crash came. He had spent 7 decades building his fortune through discipline and caution, through keeping his mouth shut and his ears open, through understanding that real wealth came from sustainable relationships rather than speculation. Yet even he could not escape what was happening. The market that had made his clients wealthy was now destroying them. The industrial titans whose empires he had helped finance were watching those empires contract. The railroads he chaired were carrying less freight as factories slowed production. In 1927, his fortune had been estimated at $100 million. By the early 1930s, that number had begun its relentless decline. Between 1933 and 1938, Stotesbury would withdraw $55 million from his J.P. Morgan account, desperately trying to maintain the lifestyle that Whitemarsh Hall demanded. The mansion consumed money like a furnace consumed coal, and there was no way to slow the burn without admitting defeat. $1 million annually, just to keep the place functioning. That figure, which Eva had once cited as proof of their magnificence, now felt like an anchor dragging them toward the bottom. The 70 gardeners still needed their salaries. The 40 servants inside still expected wages. The power plant still required fuel. The greenhouses still demanded maintenance. The infrastructure that had seemed so impressive in 1921 now represented an obligation that even $100 million could not sustain indefinitely. Edward's health began to fail in ways that went beyond simple aging. He suffered from a heart condition, and during the winter of 1937-38, he fell aboard his yacht Nadeva. The man who had spent 7 decades working every single day, who had never formally retired, who prided himself on arriving at his office before anyone else, was slowing down. His body was telling him what the market had already announced: nothing lasts forever, no matter how carefully you build it. Eva watched her husband decline and understood what it meant for Whitemarsh Hall. The parties continued, but with less frequency. The ballroom still blazed with chandeliers, but the guest lists grew shorter. The organ still played Bach and Handel through marble halls, but the music felt increasingly like an echo from a vanishing world. She was in her 60s now, and the constant performance, required to maintain their social position, had become exhausting. Philadelphia society, for its part, never fully capitulated. They had attended the parties, certainly. They had marveled at the ballroom and the gardens and the sheer scale of what the Stotesburys had built. But acceptance, that elusive prize Eva had spent millions pursuing, remained just out of reach. The old families still gathered in their drawing rooms without sending invitations. The social register still distinguished between those who belonged and those who merely had money. All the limestone and marble in Pennsylvania could not bridge that gap. The mansion that had been designed to announce permanence began revealing its fragility. Maintaining 147 rooms required constant attention. Leaks appeared in roofs. Heating systems demanded repair. The infrastructure that had seemed so solid in 1921 needed updating already. And every repair, every replacement, every maintenance call drew from accounts that were no longer being replenished at the rate they once had been. The other estates became increasingly difficult to justify. El Mirasol in Palm Beach, that Spanish Revival palace where they spent winters, required its own staff and maintenance. Wingwood House in Bar Harbor needed attention for the summer seasons. The Stotesburys were attempting to maintain 3 palaces simultaneously, while Edward's fortune contracted and his health deteriorated. Something would have to give, but neither of them was ready to admit which something it would be. The Depression ground on, year after year, transforming America in ways that made the 1920s seem like a fever dream. Banks failed. Factories closed. Unemployment climbed toward 25%. And in Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, Whitemarsh Hall stood on its hill like a monument to an era that had ended, consuming resources that were becoming scarce, demanding attention that was becoming harder to provide, representing values that were becoming harder to defend. Eva tried to maintain appearances. The jewelry still appeared at gatherings. The wine cellar behind its multiple locked doors still provided refreshment during Prohibition and beyond. The staff still moved through hidden corridors, but anyone paying attention could see the cracks forming. Parties happened less frequently. Invitations became more selective. The Stotesburys spent more time at their other estates, as though distance from Whitemarsh might make its demands less pressing. Edward continued going to his office at Drexel & Company, continued serving as chairman of the Reading Railroad's executive committee, continued the routines that had defined his life for 7 decades. But the world he had mastered was changing in fundamental ways. The partnerships that had seemed eternal were dissolving. The industrial order he had helped build was being questioned. Even banking itself, that profession he had entered at 17 and never left, was being transformed by regulation and reform. By 1938, his fortune had declined to approximately $4 million. Still wealthy by any ordinary measure, but a 96% loss from his peak. The man who had helped finance nations, who had reorganized railroads, who had been called by J.P. Morgan himself the person who knew more about banking than anyone in America, had watched his wealth evaporate in less than a decade. The Great Depression had done what no market panic before it had managed. It had broken even the most carefully constructed fortunes. And Whitemarsh Hall, that palace that was supposed to last forever, that monument to Eva's ambition and Edward's wealth, stood waiting on its hill, still magnificent, still demanding, still consuming money at a rate that was becoming unsustainable. The golden age was over, though neither Edward nor Eva was quite ready to say so out loud. The zenith had passed. What came next was the part of the story that no one wants to write. The long, slow recognition that what you built cannot be maintained, that what you purchased cannot be kept, that immortality was never actually for sale. On May 16, 1938, Edward Townsend Stotesbury went to work as he had every day for 71 years. He visited his office at Drexel & Company, attended meetings at the Reading Railroad where he still served as chairman. At 89 years old, he had never formally retired. That afternoon, on his way home to Whitemarsh Hall, he was stricken. By evening, he was dead from a heart attack. The man who had helped finance nations left an estate valued at $4 million, from $100 million to $4 million in less than a decade. The Depression had accomplished what no market panic before it had managed. Eva stood in Whitemarsh Hall surrounded by 147 rooms that suddenly felt like a prison. The will provided her with lifetime use of the mansion, but the income from Edward's trust was nowhere near sufficient to maintain it. The house now demanded an annual expenditure she could no longer meet. The staff had to go. 40 servants, some employed for over 20 years, received their notices. The 70 gardeners found other employment. The house that had required an army to function would stand mostly empty, its ballroom dark where chandeliers had blazed. Then came the harder decisions. Edward's portrait collection, one of the finest assemblages of European 18th century paintings in America, had to be sold. The prices dealers offered were insultingly low. The Depression had destroyed not just fortunes, but the market for everything those fortunes had purchased. Her jewelry followed. A diamond pendant worth $500,000 in 1912 sold for a fraction of that value. The furniture sourced from England and France, the gilt mirrors, the bronze dolphin faucets, the marble statues, everything that could be sold was sold, and still it wasn't enough. Some things she donated rather than accept pittances. The Philadelphia Museum of Art received marble statues that had graced the gardens. The nearly 10-foot-tall urns that had flanked the main fountain were positioned at the museum's west entrance, where they remain today. Eva closed Whitemarsh Hall and retreated to El Mirasol in Palm Beach. She was 73 years old, and the life she had built through 2 decades of relentless performance had collapsed in months. She tried to sell the mansion, but who could afford to purchase 147 rooms? Who would want to maintain 70 acres of formal gardens? The world had moved on. The mansion sat vacant through the early war years. Eva donated the enormous steel fence surrounding the property to the War Department. 2 miles of 8-foot-tall fencing melted down to produce metal for 18,000 guns. During the war, the Metropolitan Museum of Art used Whitemarsh Hall to warehouse treasures evacuated from New York, fearing German attacks on Manhattan. The ballroom that had hosted presidents became a storage facility. In 1943, 5 years after Edward's death, a buyer finally emerged. The Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company purchased Whitemarsh Hall for $167,000. The mansion that had cost millions to build sold for less than many individual furnishings had originally cost. Pennsalt converted it into a research laboratory, transforming ballrooms into workspaces. Eva never returned. She remained at El Mirasol until her death in 1946 at 81. Her fortune depleted, her triumph reduced to photographs and memories. The acceptance she had pursued so relentlessly never quite materialized. Philadelphia's old families had attended her parties, marveled at her mansion, but never fully opened their doors in return. She had learned what Edward had perhaps always known, that material grandeur cannot purchase human acceptance, that no amount of limestone and marble can bridge the gap between those who belong and those who merely have money. The palace was supposed to solve this problem through sheer magnificence. Instead, it became the most expensive proof that some things cannot be bought at any price. The house that was built to last forever had lost its purpose within 17 years. And on that hill in Pennsylvania, in rooms that once blazed with chandeliers and rang with organ music, researchers in white coats conducted experiments, oblivious to the ghosts of guests who had danced there, unaware that they were working in what was supposed to have been America's answer to Versailles. After Pennsylvania moved its laboratories to King of Prussia in 1963, Whitemarsh Hall stood empty once again. The company that had kept it functioning for 20 years no longer needed it. The mansion passed to Willow Associates in 1964, a property investment group that discovered what Eva had learned decades earlier. Magnificence is impossible to sell. The Philadelphia Inquirer compared the vacant structure to a Rolls-Royce limousine sitting in a parking lot full of economy cars. Whitemarsh Village, the development of modest homes that had risen on the surrounding acreage, now encircled the palace. Families grilled hamburgers in backyards that had once been formal French gardens. And in the center stood 147 rooms of emptiness, windows dark, doors locked, growing more desolate with each passing season. Willow Associates tried to find a purpose. Hotels, museums, institutions, anyone who might convert the space into something sustainable. But the economics never worked. Heating and cooling 100,000 square feet required infrastructure that would cost millions to update. The roof leaked. The plaster crumbled. Every system installed in 1921 now needed replacement. The price of restoration climbed toward tens of millions, a sum no investor could justify. So the mansion sat. The copper roof became a target for thieves who stripped it systematically, selling the metal for scrap and leaving the interior exposed to Pennsylvania weather. Water poured through ceilings that had cost fortunes to plaster and gilt. Mold spread across walls that had once displayed Rembrandts and Gainsboroughs. Vandals discovered the empty rooms in the late 1960s. They carved their names into decorative work. They smashed those 5 by 10-foot gilt mirrors. They ripped out fixtures. The ballroom where presidents had danced became a canvas for graffiti. The pipe organ that had played Bach and Handel fell silent, its pipes torn out and scattered. In 1970, the property sold at auction for $700,000 to a syndicate wanting to build high-rise apartments. The plan triggered opposition from Whitemarsh Village residents. Zoning battles followed, years of legal conflict that accomplished nothing except ensuring the mansion continued deteriorating. Springfield Township officials watched nervously as the structure attracted dangerous activity. Drug deals conducted in rooms that had hosted Philadelphia society. Fires set by vagrants, injuries from people falling through rotted floors. The mansion that had been built as a temple to permanence had become a liability. Then came 1977, when zoning laws changed to permit residential development. Suddenly, demolition became profitable. A developer could tear down Whitemarsh Hall and build 163 townhouses and single-family homes. The economics that had made preservation impossible now made destruction inevitable. The wrecking crews arrived in 1980. The limestone columns that had announced the entrance fell first. The walls that Trumbauer had designed to last centuries crumbled under mechanical force. The ballroom where 800 guests had danced disappeared into dust. The rooms where Eva had pursued acceptance became piles of broken plaster and splintered wood. Salvagers picked through the wreckage, looking for anything valuable enough to resell. Most of it was worthless by then, too damaged or too specialized to appeal to anyone. The gilt had tarnished. The marble had cracked. The grandeur that had seemed eternal in 1921 looked like junk by 1980. By the end of 1980, Whitemarsh Hall was gone. Not damaged, not repurposed. Simply erased, as though 147 rooms had never existed. The foundations were filled. The rubble was hauled away. The land was graded smooth, ready for the townhouses that would rise where industrial titans had once gathered. Stotesbury estates rose on the cleared land, modest homes for ordinary families, the kind of development that would have horrified Eva. The address 1500 Bethlehem Pike still existed, but now it marked tract housing instead of a palace. The Great Erasure was complete. America's largest private residence had survived 59 years from construction to demolition. Barely long enough for one human lifetime, not nearly long enough to justify the ambition that had created it. Today, if you drive to 1500 Bethlehem Pike in Windmore, Pennsylvania, you will find Stotesbury Estates, a development of 163 townhouses and single-family homes arranged on curved suburban streets. Families live here, children play in yards, cars pull into driveways. Nothing announces that this was once the site of America's third largest private residence. No homes occupy the actual footprint where Whitemarsh Hall stood. When demolition finished in 1980, the developers backfilled the basements and foundations rather than excavate them completely. Houses were built around the edges, leaving the center as open space. Walk through Stotesbury Estates and you are walking above rooms where presidents danced, where Eva Stotesbury pursued acceptance through sheer architectural magnificence. The earth remembers what the residents may not know, but fragments survived. The massive limestone pillars that supported the front portico still stand, 4 columns 50 feet tall that once announced the entrance to American Versailles. They rise incongruously among the townhouses, preserved as deliberate ruins, monuments to what was lost. They are all that remains standing of the main structure, these pillars that hold up nothing now except memory. The belvedere at the rear of the property survived as well. Garden walls remain in sections, low stone barriers that once bordered Jacques Greber's formal French designs. Statues dot the landscape, positioned now at intersections and roundabouts. Classical figures that once stood in carefully composed gardens, now serving as suburban decoration. The twin pillars of the estate's main gate stand on Douglas Road off Willow Grove Avenue, marking an entrance that leads nowhere significant now. These pillars stood 1 mile from the mansion, the beginning of an approach designed to build anticipation. The steel gates are gone, melted down during World War II, but the stone pillars remain. The gatehouse behind them has been converted into a private residence. Throughout the development, street names preserve the story. Trumbauer Drive honors the architect who designed the impossible. Cromwell Road remembers Eva's children from her first marriage. Stotesbury Avenue carries the banker's name forward, though few residents likely know who he was. The nomenclature is all that remains of the dynasty that never materialized. The Philadelphia Museum of Art holds pieces that Eva donated rather than sell for inadequate prices. The Clodion plasterwork from the rotundas, the marble statues that graced both interior and garden spaces, all preserved now for public viewing. The nearly 10-foot-tall urns that flanked the main fountain stand at the museum's west entrance, positioned where thousands pass them daily without knowing their origin. The Springfield Township Historical Society, founded in 1985, partly in response to Whitemarsh Hall's demolition, maintains the most comprehensive collection of photographs and documents related to the estate. Thousands of images showing rooms in their glory, gardens at their peak, parties in full splendor. Anyone interested can visit the archives and see what stood here, though photographs cannot convey the scale or reproduce the experience of actually entering those spaces. The story lives in books and articles, in academic studies of Gilded Age architecture, in cautionary tales about preservation and loss. Whitemarsh Hall is cited as one of the greatest architectural losses in American history, a structure that should have been saved, but wasn't. Preservationists point to it when arguing for stronger protection of historic buildings. But for most people living in the area, Whitemarsh Hall is simply gone, erased so completely that it might as well have never existed. The townhouses of Stotesbury Estates command prices appropriate to their suburban location. nothing more. The residents are middle-class families living ordinary lives in homes built on extraordinary ground. The complete erasure is what makes Whitemarsh Hall's story so unsettling. This was not a building destroyed by disaster or war. This was deliberate removal, the conscious decision that preservation was too expensive and demolition was profitable. The house that was supposed to establish a dynasty became real estate too valuable to leave undeveloped. Standing where Whitemarsh Hall once stood requires imagination now. You must picture the 50-foot columns rising, the ballroom stretching 64 feet, the gardens arranged in formal precision. You must reconstruct in your mind what no longer exists in reality, what survives only in photographs and the fragmentary ruins scattered through a suburban development. The palace vanished. The ambition that created it proved unsustainable. The acceptance Eva pursued through architecture remained elusive until the end. And on this Pennsylvania hillside, modest homes stand where magnificence once proclaimed that money could purchase immortality. What remains is silence where organ music played, grass where ballrooms stood, ordinary lives lived above the buried remains of extraordinary ambition. We return to the hillside where we began, understanding now what was lost and why. The grass is still there, the townhouses still stand. The ordinary life of Stotesbury Estates continues without pause. But the story of Whitemarsh Hall resonates beyond its vanished walls, beyond its demolished ballrooms, beyond the 59 years it stood between construction and erasure. This was not a tale of fire or flood, not a story of war or natural disaster. Whitemarsh Hall vanished because no one wanted it. The palace that cost millions to build sold for thousands to destroy. The house designed to last centuries barely survived 2 generations. The dynasty that was supposed to emerge from 147 rooms never materialized. Eva Stotesbury spent 5 years and a fortune trying to purchase acceptance through architecture, and Philadelphia society attended her parties, but never truly opened their doors in return. The lesson is unsettling because it challenges our fundamental assumptions about permanence. We build monuments believing they will outlast us, that stone and marble confer immortality, that sufficient grandeur commands eternal respect. Edward Stotesbury spent 70 years accumulating wealth through discipline and discretion. Yet within a decade of his death, his greatest material achievement was gone. Eva pursued social position with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Yet the palace she built as her weapon became her most expensive failure. Whitemarsh Hall teaches us that material grandeur cannot substitute for human connection, that no amount of limestone and marble can bridge the gap between wealth and belonging. The old Philadelphia families that Eva wanted to join understood something she spent her life learning. Acceptance is not architecture, permanence is not purchased, and dynasty is not designed. These emerge from sustained human relationships, from generations of trust and connection, from roots that go deeper than foundations. The mansion's demolition reveals an uncomfortable economic truth. Preservation requires someone willing to pay the ongoing cost, and magnificence designed for private use rarely transitions successfully to public function. Whitemarsh Hall was too large for any family, too expensive for any institution, too specialized for any commercial purpose. The same qualities that made it spectacular made it unsustainable. When economics and preservation collide, economics usually wins. Yet the story endures precisely because the building does not. Whitemarsh Hall lives in thousands of photographs, in academic studies, in preservationist warnings, in cautionary tales about what happens when we fail to protect architectural heritage. Its absence teaches more powerfully than its presence ever could. Every suburban home in Stotesbury Estates stands as a reminder that even the grandest structures are vulnerable. that demolition is always one economic calculation away, that nothing material guarantees immortality. The fragments that survived, those limestone pillars rising incongruously among townhouses, the statues at roundabouts, the urns at the museum entrance, serve as scattered monuments to ambition that exceeded sustainability. They are beautiful in their incompleteness, tragic in their isolation, powerful in their silence. They mark the spot where wealth attempted to purchase permanence and failed, where architecture tried to create acceptance and couldn't, where 147 rooms sought to establish dynasty, but established only a cautionary tale. Stand on that hillside today, look at the modest homes surrounding those massive pillars, and understand what Whitemarsh Hall ultimately teaches: that meaning requires more than magnificence, that legacy demands more than limestone, that immortality cannot be engineered through expenditure alone. Ava wanted Philadelphia to acknowledge her. They did, briefly, at parties that are now only photographs. Edward wanted his fortune to create something lasting. It did, but not the dynasty he imagined, rather a lesson about the limits of material ambition. The palace is gone, but its absence speaks louder than its presence ever could. In those filled foundations beneath the grass, in those backfilled basements under suburban lawns, lies the evidence that nothing we build is guaranteed to last, that preservation requires continuous choice, that permanence is always temporary, and that the greatest monuments sometimes teach their most important lessons only after they vanish. Whitemarsh Hall reminds us to value what exists while it exists, to recognize that beauty is fragile, that grandeur requires constant maintenance, and that the things we build may not survive us no matter how carefully we construct them. The 147 rooms are gone, but the question remains: what are we building today that we assume will last forever? And what would we learn if it vanished tomorrow? If this story moved you, if it made you see abandoned ambition and lost grandeur differently, hit that like button. And if you want more stories about forgotten palaces and vanished monuments, about the fragile line between permanence and erasure, subscribe to this channel. Because history's greatest lessons often come from what no longer exists, and the stories we most need to hear are the ones about things we thought would last forever, but didn't.